Welcome, everyone. We will be providing interpretation at today's session. I will be making this announcement in English and Spanish. Bienvenidos, proporcionaremos interpretación al español en la sesión de hoy. Anunciaré este mensaje en ambos idiomas. We invite everyone to please select English if you have limited Spanish proficiency, but I believe that's not the case in this session. Les invitamos a todos a seleccionar el español si tiene limitaciones en cuanto a su dominio del idioma inglés. De esta manera podrá escuchar a las intérpretes del inglés al español. Si está en su computadora, verá el globo terráqueo en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla que dice interpretación. Ahí podrá seleccionar el español. Selecciónelo al poner una palomita. Si está usando su celular o la tableta, por favor ubique y toque los 3 puntitos ligeramente y ponga una palomita en el idioma español y seleccione Done o finalizar. Este último paso es muy importante para activar la interpretación. Just a friendly reminder, if you see the interpreter raise their hand, please make sure you speak slower. The number of words in Spanish is 30% more than in English, so please be mindful of your pace. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and welcome, everyone. My name is Jenna Madow, and I am the Senior Director of Communications at Community Catalyst. I go by she, her pronouns. This is my very first Community Catalyst convening, and I am so excited to be here. 500 people registered, which is so incredible. And I know many of you are first timers as well. I believe amongst those first timers are my four fellow panelists. And as one of them shared in one of our prep sessions, the chat is where the party is at. And so for all my other fellow first timers here, welcome to the community. Go ahead and share your name and where you're from. If you're so comfortable in the chat, it's a place for us all to uplift and sort of welcome each other to this convening. And to my fellow panelists, Anika, LaTroya, Robert, and Omi, thank you so much for being here today. We are honored to be in community with you and to hear from you this afternoon. I would like to start us off by sharing the words of a clinical social worker and recent graduate of the Media Medicine and Health program at Harvard School of Medicine, which is a department or degree that I just think is so incredible. When we talk about media, medicine, and health, the intersections of all of those issues just feel so pressing right now. Ramya Chowdhury had been reflecting on the role stories play in helping to combat stigma, humanize heavy topics, and promote cultural and community connection. She shared, and I'm quoting here, "The stories we tell and the stories we hear are like the threads of a tapestry. Made with care, the fabric can connect people from different places and different experiences, united by their shared humanity." Ramya, like so many of us, understands the power that narratives and stories have in advancing social change. Just this afternoon, it was morning for me, I'm in California, but as we kicked off this convening, we heard from Fatima of the National Women's Law Center that referenced this very power, stating that now is not the time for us to stay quiet. And yet, there are so many loud voices that seek to divide us that we too often get pulled into a cycle of defense, of an us versus them mentality, that we lose sight of the very simple reality that there is more that connects us than divides us, that we are stronger together, and that a health system rooted in race equity and health justice benefits us all. While we all might not share the same language, our values are what can unite us and move us forward. And at Community Catalyst and in conversations with partners, we often hear of the need for more narrative change work that can cut through the noise and better connect our movement and our intersectional issues. We hope this session will be a source of knowledge and inspiration, and I'm so glad to have you all here. So really quick, here's what you can expect from the next hour. We've got a lot to pack in. First, I'll turn it over to each of our panelists for brief introductions and perspective sharing on how they themselves define narrative power. The chat is a place for all of us to share our own perspectives as well, and I encourage you to do so. After that, we will discuss each of our respective work and how it might inform the movement for health justice. And at the end, we've carved out time for some Q&A. Please put those in the chat. My gracious colleague, Jack, has offered to sort through those and elevate them for the speakers at the end of this session. And I'll now turn it over to Anika for introductions and a description of what narrative power means to you. Anika, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me to be in this space today. Can you hear me all well? Okay, great. So my name's Anika, she, hers. I'm the co-founding co-executive director of We Make the Future and We Make the Future Action. And for me, narrative power means the ability to dictate norms, rules, and values our society lives by contesting dominant and problematic narratives. This includes the ability to shape what's possible, to determine what's politically realistic, and even to stretch beyond the possible and establish what is inevitable. And I'll pass it to LaTroya.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm LaTroya Hester, and I am the founder and principal consultant with Comms Noir, which is a membership and consultancy for social impact communicators who are Black and trying to uplevel the work that they do as professionals to support their communities and their own careers. For me, narrative power is really, I guess I take more of a communication sort of perspective on storytelling. For me, it's your ability to transfer the emotional experience of one or maybe one community to a larger mass audience. Because, that's mass communication when you've got a single message that you're trying to get out to a mass audience. And if you're able to take an audience on that journey and so that they experience the same pain, the same joy, the same sense of urgency to either take action or settle into a new way of thinking, then that's where you're getting your warriors, your followers, your advocates, and your allies. And so for me, narrative power is your ability to transfer that emotional experience. And we really do, if I can go on a little bit of a tangent, we need to take emotion, that piece about emotion, we need to take that really serious, even in public health work, because when we're wanting to shift minds, when we're wanting to bypass people's unconscious bias, when we want to sort of dismantle some bad thinking, or maybe just take some shifts to the fundamental, ways of thinking that were given to us either by culture or by any kinds of our upbringing, it's really that emotion that will bypass that center in the mind to really get people to care, and that will activate them toward change. And so I think that for me, narrative power is really taking seriously that emotional component, taking people on a journey with our communities and with the people who we represent, and using that story to create change. I think, since I've got the mic, I think I'll also add that we find a couple of issues that come up when we're trying to tell stories. One, that we often center ourselves, I think, as communicators or even as leaders within our organizations. We sometimes center ourselves as the hero of the story. But any great story, you've got the one who's got a mission, right? And then you've got the guide. And if you're familiar with Donald Miller, who wrote the Story Brand, it's a great book, I love it. But the key is that our organizations are often the guide. So you've got the Karate Kid, right? And he's the one who's got a destiny, but then he needs Mr. Miyagi. And so oftentimes when we're representing our organizations, we position ourselves as the hero of the story when essentially we're the guide. And I think that we've got to know our position. But as communicators, and that's the world that I'm from, we're all about storytelling. We're all about taking people on a journey toward a specific message so that they'll make change. And so our job is not to be the hero, and it's not even to be the guide, but we're the narrator of that story. And what I find is that we're not often investing in our storytellers. We're not helping them to understand how to think about the stories folks are telling themselves, and exactly how to counter that narrative. And so I think that when I think about narrative power, I think about transferring that emotion, but also making sure that our narrators, our communicators, our storytellers understand the validity of their own story, but then understand that they are investing in someone else's story, giving a platform for them to share their experiences. And then also, I mean, I guess the job would be for all of us to invest in our storytellers, making sure that we have what we need to uplift and give power to the narratives that we are that we're sharing with others. So for me, that's what narrative power is. It's really transferring that emotion, taking people on a journey toward a specific message. And I think that we can't do that if we don't also empower our storytellers. And I will shoot it over to Omi.
Thank you, LaTroya. Hey, everybody. My name is Omi Sade Bernie Scott, and my pronouns are she and her. And I am the creator and chief curatorial officer of the Black Girls Guide to Surviving Menopause. And we are a narrative and culture shift multidisciplinary project using reproductive justice and healing justice to center the first person stories and experiences of Black women, Black femmes, Black trans, Black genderqueer, and Black gender non-binary people to normalize the menopause experiences. I really love this question. I've been thinking a lot about narrative since we started this work back in 2019. And, narrative is really how you choose to tell a story. And we all will apply different narratives to the same story. You got to figure out, well, who are you speaking to? And what do we know about the existing narratives or frames? And when we're thinking about how we frame a story, your framing is basically, how you make sense of complex issues. So the complexity can be a public health issue. The complexity can be voting rights. The complexity can be civil rights. The complexity can be LGBTQ rights. It can be a complex notion, a complex cultural experience, a complex political experience that you're trying to make sense of, and you're going to frame that. And so the power of the narrative is who gets to frame the story and who gets to put that framing out for public consumption, right? So I think there's power in narrative shift work, which is what we're engaged in, because you get to explore opportunities to create new messages and actions that shift the frame. And the shifting of the frame is based on values, the value proposition, your ethos, your praxis, rather than the problem. So one of the ways that we frame the way people think about menopause is that it is a natural life experience that anyone who has a uterus and ovaries will experience. Now, it's complex and it's dynamic, but it is still a natural life progression. And so rather than framing it as a problem, we take the power of that narrative back and we give it back to the community to say, this is something that you're all going to experience. How can we talk about it? I also see the power of narrative as a pathway to policy change. And as someone who's been engaged in social justice work since 1995, I have seen the power of when the narrative of marginalized and disenfranchised people is centered and centralized in any kind of policy work or campaign strategies. And I've also seen what happens when they're left out. So it's really critical for us to be very clear about how we are including marginalized experiences in the narrative shift work that we're doing that can be the pathway to the policy change that can do generational healing that we need in our community. So I'm going to pass it to Robert.
Thank you, Omi Sade. It's so wonderful to be in community with these amazing folks doing amazing work. So I'm Robert Perez. I am the founder and chief exploration officer at Wonder Strategies for Good. We're a social change communications firm. We do work in the United States and globally. And we work for progressive causes. And my title, Chief Exploration Officer, says a little bit about how we approach our work, which is to understand the psychological dynamics that prevent people from being the good people that most people have the capacity to be. Not all people, but a lot of people have the capacity to be. And I love this question about narrative power. And I want to answer it by talking about work that we did in the last year with Young Invincibles to help build narrative power. So Young Invincibles works to expand economic opportunity for young people. They do work across the United States. And in their work, they want to make sure that the perspectives of young people are heard whenever decisions that affect their collective futures are being made, which I think is a beautiful mission. And they had a goal that they wanted to influence policymakers on the Texas Commission on Community College Finance, and ultimately the Texas legislature to develop an equitable funding model for community colleges. And we work with them. And what I love about this work is that we co-led the research with them. They took the lead. We co-developed the strategies. They took the lead to help achieve this goal. For instance, they conducted landscape research to understand how public websites, public documents, how the media reports on issues of community colleges, and what they found, probably not shocking, is that most websites and media talked about students, but they talked about students. They did not necessarily feature or elevate or lift student voices. They also conducted research and in-depth qualitative interviews with former Texas legislators, legislative staff, policy advocates to understand their mindsets about community colleges and the power of young people's voices. And then they ultimately took what they learned and they launched a campaign and took the information in particular to sharpen and amplify the messages. And so I both love the process as well as the outcome. So the process included, they trained 12 student leaders and engaged over 1,000 community college students to share their stories in op-eds, social media. Students provided testimony 22 times, and news stories actually featured student voices. Shocking that we would do that when the people who benefit are the people that should be featured. And then, of course, there's also a beautiful outcome. So I'm sure I am not alone, and I hope that there are people in Texas here, because I know that there's so much happening, and we think when we hear about states like Texas and Florida, we're like, oof, there's some rough stuff going on in the world, but it made me hopeful that change is possible. So they were successful in passing this legislation. It resulted in a 20% increase in the budget from 1.8 billion to 2.2 billion. And so for me, narrative power is actually giving communities the tools and the resources they need to do the research, to understand how to shift mindsets and to actually put them in charge. And again, it's so wonderful to be with you all today.
Thank you, Robert. And I don't know if we have anyone from Young Invincibles with us today, but I know they are a longtime partner of Community Catalyst, and I think are deeply embedded in some of our vaccine equity work as well that several of our colleagues are running. So thank you. And this is sort of the moment in the conversation where I'll really look to each of our panelists to provide more deep explanation about the work and their worldview in terms of how they approach this. And so coincidentally, I want to start with Robert. So it's a nice segue here. And Robert, I'm really in conversations with you. I'm always really it's important for me, and sort of I always have to remind myself sort of the importance of sort of how do we think about the brain and how the brain works and how we connect with people's emotion. I think we're often so used to being in rooms amongst ourselves that we make a lot of assumptions about others. So if you don't mind, can you spend a little time talking about Heartwired? And if there's any other sort of examples of how allied movements have made progress on complex policy issues by connecting with people on an emotional level, and then how this sort of approach has helped us could help us cut through the noise and bring more people across the table. I think what you described in your opening remarks around most people, not all, but most people can find a deeper emotional connection. So talk to us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, and just to say that, like, one thing that informs our work is that most people have a deep psychological need to see themselves as good, and that informs how they think about the world. And so when they're doing the things that they're doing, they think that they're doing the right thing. The only people who I think are absolutely unreachable are sociopaths and psychopaths, like people running for president of the United States, as an example. But I digress. So I want to talk a little bit about the brain. So in the work that we do, we use the psychological understanding of how people make decisions on emotionally complex and socially sensitive issues. And we have core concepts, core psychological concepts that inform our work. And one of those core concepts is what we refer to as the upstairs brain, downstairs brain. And it's actually not Wonder's metaphor. We read about it and learned about it from the Whole Brain Child, which is about children's emotional development. But despite the fact that it's about children's emotional development, it's actually a really powerful metaphor to understanding how the brain works. So I'm just going to actually even just read from this passage from the Whole Brain Child. Imagine your brain is a house with both a downstairs and an upstairs. The downstairs brain includes the brainstem and the limbic region, which are located in the lower parts of the brain from the top of your neck to about the bridge of your nose. Scientists talk about these lower areas being more primitive because they're responsible for basic functions like breathing and blinking, for innate reactions and impulses like should I fight or flight, fight or flee, or for strong emotions like anger and fear. And then your upstairs brain is completely different. It's made up of the cerebral cortex and its various parts, and particularly the ones directly behind your forehead right here, including what's called the middle prefrontal cortex. And unlike your more basic downstairs brain, the upstairs brain is more evolved. It's our Homo sapien brain. That's another way to think about it. And it can give you a fuller perspective on the world. You might imagine it as a light-filled second-story study or library full of windows and skylights that allow you to see things more clearly. So what does this have to do with social issues? Well, we need our prefrontal cortex to make decisions that are new and or novel to us. We need our upstairs brain to be engaged in decision making. But the challenge is that when something is new and or if we are triggered in any way, and we are often triggered for various reasons on social issues, our downstairs brain or our amygdala, which is what it's called, has the capacity to hijack our upstairs brain. If you have ever been in a fight with a significant other, or engaged, if you have children and fighting with your children, it is not the time to have a rational argument. So we're like, why don't our rational arguments work? Well, it is because we are trapped in our downstairs brain. So here's the bad news. On the issue that so many of us are working on, we have opponents who are really good at triggering our downstairs brain. Their messages and their messengers flood our downstairs brain with big negative emotions. It cuts off access to our upstairs brain. And to be honest, their job is a lot easier than our job. Our job is more emotionally complex. There is good news, though, which is that at Wonder, we have identified and developed a two-step psychological process to messaging interventions. We refer to our messages not as just messages, but to actual interventions, because they're meant to untie the psychological knots that prevent people from being the good people who they have the capacity to be. And so here's the basic approach. Step one is to calm the downstairs brain, and familiarity is what we know calms the downstairs brain. So it's important in messaging interventions to introduce the familiar. And I've heard my colleagues on this say so much of what I'm sharing here, to introduce shared values and shared life motivations, to elevate related, trusted messengers, to include shared lived experiences like caring for family and or wanting to live a healthy, productive life. So that's step one. And then step two is to appeal to the upstairs brain. And successful messaging interventions that we've tested on countless issues move people from to hope, to optimism, and to into compassion. And I can, we've done this on a range of issues, from most recently on guaranteed income, the work we did with Young Invincibles. This is core to that approach, to making medical aid in dying a legal option for people who have 6 or less months to live. We actually first put this approach and developed it in winning the freedom to marry for same-sex couples in the United States. And we're doing it on issues like racial justice, racism, and other housing and homelessness as well. I'll stop there, and I certainly welcome questions as well, and also for you to ask other follow-up questions, Jenna.
Thank you, Robert. And folks should please ask your questions in the chat. We'll come back to them at the end. I really appreciate the simplicity of the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain. And I know, Robert, your team has quite a few resources you've shared or will continue to share to make that more accessible to folks who are here today. So thank you.
Yep.
With that, I'll turn it over to Anika, who comes to us from We Make the Future, and you have done incredible work on the race class narrative and building out a collection of resources and tools to help neutralize sort of the use of dog whistle racism to win on issues. I think several of our panelists have alluded to sort of some of this work, and I know I have your resources bookmarked and frequent them quite often. Can you talk more about that work and how it might help us build a more united movement for health justice? Why it's important for us to name a villain in this work, a shared villain? And what are some of the common traps that even the most progressive amongst us might fall into?
Yeah, so I first want to root this answer in our theory of change, because that's, what informs all of this work. And so, our theory of change is that messages have to be tied to place and to people. And so that is why We Make the Future largely works with base building, power building organizations that are out in communities, building a base of supporters for, a multiracial democracy, which would include health justice. It includes all the things, to be the ones that set the terms of the debate, right? As I noted earlier, how do you build narrative power is you're the ones that are setting the terms of the debate, which then makes our policy solutions make sense, right? And feel worth fighting for. And so I'm going to use an analogy, a church choir analogy, to talk through this theory of change. To be completely honest, I grew up Muslim. I've only gone into a church for like a college assignment. So I'm doing like my best, but I just feel like it makes really good sense using this analogy. So think about, if there is a church or a congregation in a neighborhood that is like changing, right? But this congregation is made up of a crew of folks that have been going there. They're very values aligned, right? They see the world in the same way. And unfortunately, like they have not seen an increase in like membership, like people coming to the church to find a place to belong, to grow, right? This crew of people that are values aligned and can go to this place to find connection, right? And so they've been singing from a pretty old hymn book, right? It's not really resonant. It's not really meeting the moment, but it's what they've had, right? And they're recognizing more and more that they have to adapt, right, to just the changing conditions, like actually like not just be checking the temperature by reading from it, but changing the temperature, right? And like bringing more people in. And so we work with groups to update that hymn book, right? Like we would essentially work with, Robert, and many other groups that are doing amazing research to update that hymn book, but we really need the choir to be a part of that process, right? Because they're the ones ultimately singing from it. And oftentimes hymn books are being updated by people who are not singing from them, right? They just get delivered to your house and you're expected to use them. And so why we bring in organizers like from all these groups to be a part of the research design, like what are the actual challenges that you're facing that this hymn book must address? Right? Like, how do we make it so that everyone feels like they are in this hymn book together, right? By being explicit about race and class. How do we build this together so that you ultimately feel like you can sing from this with authenticity, right? Because you actually were a part of creating this hymn book. So now we have the hymn book, right? It's been updated. People see themselves in it. But now we have to go to choir practice, right? Because if we're not singing from the same songbook with our different authenticities, we could be using the wrong pitches, right? It's a cacophony of noises, like nobody actually wants to hear it. And so that second part is really building alignment, right, across an ecosystem of people. And so that is like the largest body of work that we hold as We Make the Future, is like supporting people to be singing from the same songbook. Some people might be like, I like the old hymn book. I've been singing from it and I want to keep singing from it. Or like, I don't really, like I like go to practice every now and then, but I'm just constantly responding to other things. And like, I haven't made space to like do something new. Right. And so like, there's a lot of like quality time that we spend together with groups, building the alignment to be all singing from the same. And maybe sometimes it's like, I don't have a ride to the church, right? Like I can't afford the book. So we have to address all of those things, because just because we got the book doesn't mean that everyone has access to get there to sing from it. And then the last thing is, we've got the updated hymn book. We're going to choir practice. We got everyone coming that like needs to be there, should be there, has been a part of the process. And then the last is like, but now how do other people hear us singing, right? We haven't built the choir yet. And so then we work with groups to get the word out. So, right, like what are aspects of the hymn book that can be put on radio ads? What are aspects of the hymn book that can go on a billboard? What are aspects of the hymn book that can go on literature that you leave and go canvas with your neighbors, or to like take to the local grocery store or ethnic media, or, you know, like a mosque or another church, right? Like to spread the word about like what is it that we're trying to build together. Doesn't mean that you have to join a church. Maybe you want to partner with another church because you believe in the same values, right? And so those are kind of the three legs of the stool, we would say, on how we can build, you know, this movement towards health justice. And I know this is specifically about health, right? But like we have to build a broader, like progressive vision that people can see themselves in, that would inform a variety of issues that we all care about, including health. And the second question you had was like, why do we have to name a villain, right? There's going to be some people who are literally putting up barricades to get into these places, right? So that we can't even get inside, or burning our hymn books on fire, like literally, right? Or banning them. And so we have to name who is doing these things. Otherwise, you can't protest at structural racism's house. It's just like you have to name who is keeping us there. Like I understand that like we have been politically educated to talk about things in systems, which I totally get because these are systems, but people have built these systems, right? And we have to like unpack like all that there's these decisions that are being made for people to do these things. And so we have to name the actual people that are keeping us from the vision that we want, right? And I know that a lot of times, depending on like your legal compliance, right, you can only be so direct. And so there's definitely other ways that you can call it out. And I hope you would, you know, preview our resources to see the variety of ways people have chosen to do that. And a lot of the research we do is like, what is the most effective villain to tell based on your story, based on your context? And then the last one, what are some of the common traps that even progressives fall into? I think passive voice is one of them, right? Passive voice means you're not naming the cause, right? Another way that we do that is saying like, you know, home ownership rates are falling. Where did they fall? Like there isn't like a hole in the ground that they fell into, right? Like there are people making it so that we can't live in our homes, right? Or like the racial wealth gap is growing. Like it's just growing naturally. Like these words like gap, falling, disproportionate, they're not naming any villainy. And it actually exacerbates stereotypes about people of color because you're not providing an origin story. So we often feel like they know what I mean, but no, not everyone gets to be on a panel like this. They're doing other jobs out in the world, right? And so like these are all political education moments. The last thing is, there's a couple. One is like, we love to lead with problems. People got 99 problems. They don't want yours, which is what many of my fellow esteemed panelists said is you have to lead with values, right? And then name the villain who is violating that value, right? That's the way that you lead into what's happening versus just leading with the problem that's in passive voice, not connecting to why I should care about that to begin with. The third one is we love to sell our recipes, but not the brownie, the delicious brownie, right? When you go into a grocery store and you're in the bakery aisle, are all the brownie boxes facing recipe side front? No, because nobody cares. Nobody cares how much butter, how much flour, how much oil. They pick the box because they have this delicious brownie on the front with all the gooey things on it. Like that's why I'm buying that box, right? And so like we have the best recipes, but we have a terrible job of selling the outcome, right? The brownie is the outcome. So, you know, don't take your policy ideas out in public. Like that's like what you're doing here to organize. But like the people out there want to know what is the outcome of your policy, right? It's to be able to be home the first time your newborn smiles, right? Not paid time off. Like they want to know what's the outcome of that paid time off, like, right? And then lastly, we got to talk about race explicitly, most importantly. And that is why we care so much about building the hymn book together, because we want you to feel authentic about speaking this. We've been so deeply like taught in many ways, even the progressive movement, to not name race, right? and that it feels really uncomfortable. So there's a lot of internal work that needs to happen, right? And that it's also like we have to talk about it, because clearly not talking about it has led us to this many political moments that brought us here. And like it has been the tried and true like opposition strategy, right? Is to like use that to divide us. And if we're not even naming it, we're not even in the same playing field as what they're saying, right? And there are effective ways to do that, right? And that is why like we have all this amazing research. You know, we're working with organizers to like actually try these messages on the door so we can have a feedback loop, right? Research has to be informed by actual organizing. It has to have a feedback loop so that we can continue to grow how we do this work together.
I could just give each of you all a mic for an hour and just, you know, I'm getting goosebumps because it is all just such important grounding work for all of us to have a collective vision together. So thank you. Omi, I'd love to hear from you next. In prepping for this interview, I watched an interview you had on PBS where you were talking about the growth of your community, and you discussed the healing power of telling our own stories and of hearing other people's stories. Can you share more about sort of how you've approached building and maintaining a community of engaged storytellers and sort of your outlook on a multimedia approach? We've touched on it a little bit, but the way people consume media has changed so much. And I'd love to know sort of more around that. And could you even speak a little bit more deeply about the role that intersectionality plays in our work? You mentioned it a bit in your intro, but I'd love to dig a little bit more, please.
Sure. So I think for me to answer your questions, I want to do a little framing. Look at that.
Great. Look at us, all communicators.
Well, one of my favorite quotes is by June Jordan, and she says that the role of the artist is to make revolution irresistible, right? So something that Anika just talked about is the irresistible nature of the brownie. It's not necessarily the recipe that is going to draw the person to pick the brownie box up. It's the packaging. So this is why narrative and culture shift work, why storytelling and multimedia approaches to social justice work is critical, because it makes revolutionary work irresistible, right? And I think a lot about some of the ways that I have grown and my own understanding of how change happens, how social change happens, how social justice work happens, how liberation happens, and not from a political progressive standpoint, but from a very human-centered human rights standpoint. And I'm really grateful that when I first started working in nonprofits and doing social justice work in the 90s, my education, my upbringing in movement work was through popular education and pedagogy of the oppressed. So much of the work that we did when I first started doing community organizing, cultural organizing, and the like was like learning, how are you going to activate community members who have been historically, generationally disenfranchised and marginalized? Like, what's going to create that opportunity in that space? Well, the best way to do that is through stories. You don't start with a meta-analysis of the social political situation that has impacted that community. That's not your on-ramp to the conversation. Your on-ramp to the conversation is simply to create the space that's both dialectical and dialogical. So that means that there will be times where people will have very, very different opinions of what a situation is based on how they're impacted by the situation historically, contemporarily, and the like. And there are ways that we get to teach each other. And one of the things I really love about pedagogy of the press is that we get to teach each other. And we teach each other first through story, right? So the work that we are doing with the Black Girl's Guide to Surviving Menopause came online as a result of me taking a sabbatical from social justice work. I was really exhausted and felt like I wanted to take a break in 2018, and that kind of launched me into a space that I had absolutely no idea existed. The growing landscape and ecosystem around reproductive justice, healing justice, women's health, gender equity, health justice continues to grow, especially as people are continuing to understand the intersectional nature of the work, which I think is kind of, complicated for some folk, because when I talk about menopause from a reproductive justice framework, I'm talking about it from a human justice framework. Again, framing. a lot of the people who say that they do reproductive justice work don't actually know the origin story of reproductive justice. They can't name the 12 founders who are all Black women. They can't name the origin story of them traveling to Cairo, Egypt to participate in a global conference on women's health as people who worked for traditionally white-led reproductive health organizations, domestic violence organizations, organizations focused on sexual assault and harm reduction, and realized while they were in Cairo, Egypt, that the approach, the narrative, and the framing was continuing to marginalize communities of color, poor people, working class people, LGBTQ people, indigenous people. And so they wanted to reframe how we do reproductive rights and reproductive health work. And they reframed it through a human rights framework. So they looked at the UN's human rights framework and said, how can we practically apply this to our work? And what will happen as a result of that? How will our work be transformed? Who will we reach that we haven't reached before? What policy work will we be able to engage in that we haven't been able to engage in before? How will that change our partnerships and the communities that we get to work with? And that will be a 30-year anniversary next year. 1994 was that year. And think about, this is 1994, so this is pre-Instagram, this is pre-social media. These 12 Black women came back to the United States and took out a full page ad in the Washington Post. And they had over 800 people sign off saying that they stand with human rights. This is a big deal. Like, this is a really big deal. And so I love origin stories. I'm a nerd in that way. And I love inviting those people into the space. So when we do our work with the Black Girls Guide, we know that people are going to have a lot of different ways that they understand their bodies. And in particular, if you have lived inside of a body that you've never felt safe in particular in this country, your ability to lean into how your body changes is really complicated. And so what do we get to do? The first thing we get to do is invite people to feel safe inside their own bodies. And we start exploring people's own stories and narratives about their relationship with their body. And then we start teasing out, well, where did you come to understand that relationship with your body? Who told you that? Where did that come from? Inside your family, inside your school, inside your community, inside society? Where is the narrative coming from? And how do you grab hold of the narrative and shift it so that way your story and your needs are centered? So that is truly healing work. We also do intergenerational storytelling events because we know that not everybody who experiences menopause is going to experience it in their 40s or 50s or 60s. We have so many people who experience menopause in their 20s and 30s for vast and sundry reasons, and that narrative is never put out into the world. So we've been very intentional about elevating those stories on our podcast. We've also been very intentional about elevating the stories of genderqueer people and their experiences with menopause, and trans people and their experiences with menopause. Again, because what we're offering from a popular education, pedagogy of the oppressed way is like we're teaching each other, right? So there may be a way that I share my narrative that matches up with what you're experiencing and it resonates, and then it gets amplified. And so then we see ourselves as kindred, right? Or there may be a way I share a narrative that you've never heard before. And so then you're like, oh, this is new information to me. So you become curious. That's the first place for us. It's like, be curious, because curiosity is such a beautiful kind of potent way to elicit compassion, right? So we're like, oh, well, this is a narrative you never heard before. How do we introduce narratives in that way? So we do it in 3-4 different ways. The podcast, through audio. So we love to listen to the audio, video, and we will put the video back out so people can, check it out for themselves, because sometimes people don't want to listen to audio. It's not their thing. It's not how they learn. It's not how they process. It's not how they understand or make meaning of the world. And then we also do in person, because again, not everybody wants to listen or watch. Some people need to be in the room and be in the space and feel the energy of the people that they're talking to. And then we also have self-published zines. And I got turned on to zines by a group of young people who were working for something called the Institute for Public Media Arts. Now that's old school. This is again like people taking copy paper and creating zines and then passing them out when we were doing actions in community. I love zines. Zines have a history that go back to World War II, right? This is the way in which community members, workers, could get information out into the community around what's going on and invite people, no matter what their class is, to be involved in the liberation of all people. And so we started making zines. So we have a zine called The Messages from the Menopausal Multiverse. It's not about menopause. The zine is about how we keep each other safe. The zine is about flipping narratives around aging and women. The zine is about motherhood. So you can create all of these pathways around narrative and invite people to participate, invite people to instruct, invite people to change. We have a curriculum that's open sourced. So people can come in and they can add to the curriculum that we've created with this dialogical tool we created 2 years ago called the Say More Deck. It's 100 dialogical cards that you can use as conversation prompts to talk about bodily autonomy, body sovereignty, and how your body changes over time. And we created this open source curriculum so people can influence the narrative that we're building together. So we also invite our community to be co-conspirators in creating new narratives around how we understand our bodies. So it's not going to be this thing where we're like, we're the experts. Like, no, you're the expert of your body. Tell me your story. And let me tell you my story. And let's see where our stories connect and where they diverge. And let's see what the larger narrative is and how do we want to influence that and change that. And I'm grateful for the experience of doing work around voting rights and reproductive justice and all these things. I've been a training director before. So it always makes me think about what's the best way, what's the best pedagogy to hold this. And it's very exciting work for us.
Thank you. That was incredible. And I really appreciate the way you were explicit about all the different ways people might engage with, we call it content, right? But like that, we can't make assumptions that everyone learns or grows or engages in the same place, and sort of really thinking about the different channels and avenues for building that community connection. And to me, it oh, go ahead.
I say one more thing. I think also as we see millennials and Gen Zs and other folk being much more clear about their learning styles and how they process information, I think that and people are being much more vulnerable about that as well. That is an invitation for us to be much more adaptable and have a diversity of communication styles that we offer to people. Some of the old ways that we would do communication strategy work or training work doesn't work when you have someone saying to you, I am really neurodivergent and this is not going to work for me. And if we continue to stay on that path, then we're again invisibilizing folk in the process.
I don't know if you can see it, but you're getting a lot of applauses in the chat. They're just fluttering. And it's a really important, I often think that we use a lot of the tools that are very outdated. We often just, put out a press release because that's what we've always done on things, and sort of thinking much more nuanced about that experience. And I think the way you described connecting on an emotional level, we can't expect folks to take a stand on policy issues if they can't connect on that deeper level. And so thank you. LaTroya, I'd love to turn it over to you. Welcome. And, you've built a community of Black communicators working to advance social issues at the intersection of health. And so I'd love to hear sort of your perspective to build upon what we've heard today around how we can build more sort of culturally sensitive communications materials, but also empowering a workforce and sort of the communicators who can shepherd us through all of this work. So welcome.
Sure. Yeah. So I got to say, at this point, I've been doing health communications for about 10, 15 years, and there's always these conversations around creating more culturally sensitive communications or more culturally competent communications. And I think that is something to strive for. I think it has its place. But that tends to make us sort of run and create another language guide, right? And I was reading this really great report, and I don't know if I got it from someone on this panel, but it's created for the Communications Network. It's their Race and Racism report, and I think it was done with WeCollab, and I'm not sure, but I'll drop that in the link in a little bit. But one of the things that they say is that despite all of the efforts, all of the ways you can go about communicating, at the end of the day, when it comes to race and racism, if you're going to make a difference, it's really personal. It's about your personal experiences. It's about the organization's willingness to make it so common and natural to speak the language of people who are not that didn't come from your same background. They have different experiences from you, but if the people who work in your organization don't have that as a part of their circle of influence, their personal relationships, that's going to influence the culture within your organization. And so that actually impacts the way in which your external communications comes off. When internally there's something a little fishy, when internally there's some tensions, there's some people who haven't done the work, there is a lot of strategy around how we go about using this framework or that framework to really call out racism, or to use asset-based framing to make sure that we are being culturally sensitive or what have you. It's all for naught if in your personal life you haven't done the work, if everyone in the organization isn't willing to do the work. And I think that we have such a responsibility as communicators to do the work, because when we create a message, okay, it has the power to shift culture in one way or the other. I often talk with, let me say, so as a part of what we do with Comms Noir, as we're building our community, we are working to really ensure that the people who are creating the messages are fully equipped to do so. So like I said, I think that we're not always investing in our storytellers. And it's a huge responsibility. I work a lot with young people in youth ministry, and I always tell them this story of this young woman who, not young, she's 78, but she is near and dear to my heart. And she was talking to me about her childhood and her father's childhood. And he would go out to the swamps in West Texas looking for bullfrogs, and he would have his BB gun. Now, let me say, this is not about shooting bullfrogs, I promise. But what he would do is he would go out and he would take the little BBs and he would find a bullfrog and he would roll the BB toward the bullfrog. And what does the bullfrog do? Slurp it up, right? Apparently bullfrogs will eat anything that's moving, anything at all. And when a bullfrog slurps up just one BB, no big deal. But after 10, 20, 30 BBs, what happens to a bullfrog? It's essentially pinned to the ground and unable to do the magnificent things it was created to be able to do, which is to leap really, really high. And I think that as communicators, we have to be aware that most people are like bullfrogs and that they passively slurp up the BBs, right? I always tell the young people, don't eat the BBs. We have to be able to we have to be responsible with the fact that we are creating messages that people are often not analyzing, they're often not questioning. And that subtle shift that happens so slowly, and it happens without their permission. And so I think that we as communicators, if we're really interested in health justice and social justice, we have to be really, really aware that people are consuming messages and stories passively. And we want to empower them to be able to ask questions like, who created this message? What is the story? What is the frame? How did they create that? What were the tactics that they used to make me so interested in this story? When I was working as the director of communications for the Center for Black Health and Equity, and it came to COVID and misinformation around the vaccine, we took that entire concept, this idea that when she told me the story about the bullfrog, it wasn't about media messaging, but that's how I heard it. And I said, if we're going to combat misinformation, one, we validate the stories that people have been telling themselves, because those stories are valid. Trust. I mean, there were reasons to hesitate when it came to the vaccine, but more importantly, we need to empower people to become media literate, to understand, to spot a BB when they see it, right? To understand the messages that are coming toward them, to interpret the stories, to decide what gets in and what doesn't get in, so that we don't see cultural shifts in the wrong direction. And so for me, Comms Noir is just about empowering Black communicators to create the kinds of messages that'll make a positive impact on culture and on society, but always being aware of that responsibility, because sometimes our audiences are just passive because because the education is not there, and that's a part of what we're supposed to be doing. And so, yeah, it's not, to circle back, it's not enough to just be culturally sensitive. We've got to take on this great responsibility of recognizing, the audiences that we're engaging with and the impact we have on culture.
It's really powerful. I think too, it's important for me to note that this work does not lay on just the shoulders of the people on the communications team, right? This is being communicators is in being community and organizing. It's an organizing tool. And so there's often those of us who are sort of putting communications out into the world, we have such a privilege and power in that, and that's really important, but we are all in this together, and that each and every one of us are in communities having conversations and engaging. And sort of to a previous panelist point, media is we're constantly just consuming and getting touch points, and it doesn't just come from the Associated Press. It comes from TikTok, it comes from Instagram, it comes from someone you met on the corner. And so we all just need to sort of put best practices forward when we're out in the world talking about these issues. So thank you. I really do think we need more time for this conversation. So apologies to everyone. We haven't had time for questions. We might have time for one or two. Are there any that we've seen in the chat? I have not seen any, but it's very possible I've missed one. Okay, so I'm going to just close us out really quick. Thank you to our panelists today for your time, and for everyone tuning in from home. Again, this could be, I almost want to set up a side conversation with each and every one of you to sit down, because I think we are just starting to sort of scratch the surface. So thank you. I encourage folks to read and review the documents that have been shared in chat. And there's functionality with this convening where you can look up our panelists and connect with them one-on-one. This is just the start of a conversation. A little plug for my colleagues and some future programming. Tomorrow, Plenary 4 at 4 p.m. Eastern, Nothing for Us Without Us, Shifting Power by Centering People Most Impacted by Health Inequities. We'll build upon this dialogue and give folks a deeper look into the importance of centering people most impacted by health inequity in organizing and storytelling efforts. If you want to get practical tools for cultivating stories and storytellers in your organizing and advocacy efforts, be sure to tune into the session tomorrow. I believe it's tomorrow. Tomorrow's Wednesday. Flip the Script at 12:45 Eastern. We've got some partners and folks sort of leading some storytelling work there, and I'm so excited. Those will be some really tangible tools that folks can take home with them. Please fill out the survey that was shared by Barbara. Thank you, Barbara, in the chat. It shouldn't take more than a minute of your time. It's really important to us that we continue to evolve and create spaces that are meaningful to you. And so we want to hear from you. And with that, I am so thankful for everyone being here. I'm sorry we didn't have more time to hear closing remarks from folks, but I want to respect the schedule and stay on track. So thank you, everyone.